Well, hello. Thank you so much for joining me today, Shawn. We are going to be talking about a certain little book, um, potentially on a Booker Prize long list somewhere. Shawn, what is this lovely book that we are talking about today?
This lovely book, and we should be, just in case somebody doesn't know who I am on your channel, and vice versa, I'm
Just
Shawn the Book
completely
Maniac.
blazing
Who the
past.
heck are
Everyone knows
you?
Shawn.
Who the heck are you?
I am Bob the Booker, and I largely talk a bit about the Booker Prize. Probably should diversify at some point. Who knows? And
Well,
I am
not right
joined
now.
by.
Not right now. And I'm right there with you, especially about this particular novel. So, if you're watching my channel and you don't know Bob the Booker, you must go and subscribe, and you'll probably unsubscribe from me. And if you're seeing me on Bob's, give me a chance. The book we're going to be discussing is Damon Galgut's The Promise, which is on the long list, and we both have it. And I think we both really liked it. I would say we both loved it in a
Yes.
five-star way, Bob.
Yes, absolutely, which is nice. I think it's always quite scary when you're going to sort of read a book alongside someone. And I've not done too many buddy reads, but when sort of you really love a book and you're sort of like, hey, let's talk about this. And the other person's like, yeah, it's all right. It's always quite hard. So I was delighted that you actually really loved this book as well. Because for me, I just like this was mind blowing. Um, so yeah, really, and especially I think I was reading it whilst I was like quite tired and not that focused in parts, and it drew me in enough to sort of remind me why I like reading. So I mean that's praise, I guess. How sort of on a sort of loose basis, how did you find the book? What were your sort of first sort of takes from it?
I thought this was so the first thing to say to get this in early in the discussion is that I was pissed off that there were no black South African writers nominated in the Booker and
Mm.
two white South African writers. I don't know which black South African writers had novels published that would have been eligible, but there must have been at least a handful, and if not more than a handful. And I like Damon Galgut's writing. I've read one novel by him, The Good Doctor. I loved it. And this novel blew me out of the water. So, I mean, if you have to be a white writer, and if you have to be a white writer from South Africa, and if you have to be a white writer from South Africa who gets your book nominated and nobody among your black literary colleagues gets any attention, this is the book you should write. It was a profound exploration of whiteness and the obtuseness and casual and formal colonial racism against the black population that for me, and we'll get into this maybe a little bit later, is applicable across the globe. Anywhere white people have unfortunately been in control for too long. I thought it was absolutely gobsmacking.
Mm-hmm. Well said. And on that note, do you want to sort of say a little bit about what the book is about, sort of in a loose sort of sense again?
Yes, and this is a good chance for us to mention that we're going to have the first part to be non-spoilery. So we're only going to talk about what's on the plot synopsis on Goodreads or on the inside flap, and maybe go just a few steps past that to talk about some very small things in the story in the first chapter. It's 4 chapters. And it's about a white Afrikaner family, the Swartz family. The first chapter is called Ma, because Ma is on her death. Ma has died, and she wasn't that old. So she has teenage kids, and it's the family all coming home for her funeral. There's 3 kids and her husband and some in-laws and so on. And without going into any spoilers, there's 3 more chapters that each is about a subsequent death in the family and the family coming together over a period of, I think, 20 years.
Yeah, I think it's around that.
And all at various times in apartheid and then post-apartheid South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And it is so that's enough from me. Bob, what about the Salome part of the story? Because that's crucial.
Yes. So the kind of the promise that's at the heart of the sort of title of the book is sort of a bit of a not only a sort of a promise made to this character Salome, who has been is she a maid? Was that her role? She's sort of of the family. She's a black South African, and she is the kind of the promise to her is that this sort of house and sort of some sort of wealth to some degree will be passed along to her, and that kind of is also a bit of a play on the sort of national picture of South Africa, of the promise of the rainbow nation, of you know, South Africa kind of coming together and being a country where everyone is equal. And so I think this book really investigates that idea and kind of mocks it, or not mocks it, but sort of pokes holes at the fact that this has not really been achieved in South Africa, and how, you know, this has been sort of not only in kind of an individual sense to Salome, but also in a kind of national sense. The idea of a white family, and this sort of farmer family, handing something over, and, you know, handing over privilege or resources or things that they've gained, is a lot more complicated, and it has not really come to fruition. So I think that's a really interesting thing. That I'm often quite interested after I've read a book at kind of thinking again about the title, and I feel like this is a book that is quite subtle with that, because there is obviously a very simple promise at the heart of it in terms of this maid, but as soon as you sort of dig into the sort of wider picture around South Africa, and I must admit, I say this not being an expert, not having ever been there, and sort of knowing relatively few South Africans, I think this is such an interesting way of investigating that. And I think, kind of like you were saying, Shawn, I know that some people have been a bit nervous around the fact that it's a white South African writing about race and racism. And I think actually, I think because it investigates it from within, almost, you know, from within a white Afrikaner family, I think that's what's sort of so successful about it, is because it actually isn't afraid to sort of investigate that sort of within and kind of tear it apart a little bit.
Maybe this is a good point to mention that both of us, I think, were sold on this novel when we watched Eric Karl Anderson's review. Put a link in the show notes to that review, and he talked in a way, and I just watched it. I've watched it twice in the last 2 days, because I watched it when it put out, but when you haven't read the novel, you know, and then I'd finished reading the novel, I couldn't remember exactly what his problems or what his issues were. So I've watched it twice, so I think I've got it pretty much embedded. Eric, are you impressed? I watched it twice. It's really problematic that we are taken so deeply into the racist thinking and the emotions and actions of these white characters.
Yeah.
And at times you aren't really sure. I'm not sure that I ever wondered what the author was up to or what the author believed, but certainly there is something going on with the point of view where the actual narrator of the story, who switches from first to second to third person a lot, seems like a bit of a racist, but just at times. And that makes for some uncomfortable reading.
Yes, I think.
Now,
oh, sorry. Yeah.
Please, no, you go ahead. I think I'm done with that thought.
No, I was going to say I totally agree. I think part of what makes this novel, I think, so uncomfortable is it kind of is a sort of long, hard look, sort of at the characters, and kind of by proxy, kind of at yourself. And it is very, I kind of feel, because I was nervous about that going into it. I'd heard Eric's review, it sounded great. I've read something by Galgut before and adored it. And so I was like, well, I'm going to trust him on this. I'm going to trust Eric, I'm going to trust Damon Galgut on this. But it does very much feel as a book like kind of going into the belly of the beast. I think it's not sort of sitting on the sidelines and just observing this family. It makes you go into their heads a bit, which is the discomfort. But I think it's an uncomfortable conversation, right? So I think
and it's a bit of a not delightful. It's a bit of a powerful mind fuck, because he also makes you really like a lot of these horrifically racist white characters. For example, we don't need to go into it. There's nothing really spoilery I could say about them, but there's an aunt and uncle that we meet when Ma's dead, just as they're taking her body out of the family home, and they are so racist, and he makes them likable and kind of funny. And he does a whole bunch of things like that, where he doesn't make it easy for you to just have your liberal anti-racist values. He really gets you hooked into the story. And the main characters here are the dad
Mm.
and the three kids. And we see racism raise its ugly head in a variety of contexts over the years.
Yeah.
And we are emotionally invested in these characters. And what I think the genius, like I don't think I'm going to be able to express it well in this. This is a thought about this book in progress, but in interrogating the whiteness and the colonialism and the racism, he is creating a story that is, in its title, it's about the promise made to the Black maid.
Yeah.
But he makes it so easy to completely forget about them. But this is not a novel where it's a racist novel where the Black characters take a back seat. He's flipping it on its head, and he's doing something that's just, I don't know, it's like sorcery, because I kept forgetting about Salome.
Yeah.
Because he was making the story of this fucked up Afrikaner family so beguilingly interesting.
Yeah.
And he was doing a number on me with it. And I think it was profound.
I think it was, because I think that's something I thought was quite interesting, sort of stepping back and thinking about it after the book, because I guess that is the kind of thing, right? That, you know, people will sort of jokingly be like, oh, you know, my racist uncle, whatever, you know, there's that kind of trope almost of, but I think I think what's kind of quite clever about this book is kind of actually, yes, like you may know someone who's very close to you, sort of bound by family, where you can't just sort of easily escape, who has incredibly hostile and racist or violent views on sort of topics. And the kind of nuance of like absolutely hating that opinion and hating what that kind of means for that person, but also that person is your relative who you have other feelings about, and it's never kind of quite as clear cut as oh, you know, that's my homophobic aunt, we don't like, you know, everything about her is terrible, because actually it may be like she's also the one who like taught you to read when you're a kid, you know. There are those sort of, and so that's what I think is really interesting about this book, is how it kind of, it plays at those, and kind of like you said, that's intensely uncomfortable, because you like a character and then they say or do something and you're like, oh gosh, this is infuriating, because actually I wanted to root for this character, or I was enjoying their sense of humor, and then they went and did something incredibly racist. And I think that also unpicks actually a lot of that kind of national picture of a country, right? That you know, not necessarily just South Africa, but that like we might kind of want to see ourselves as being free of racism in a country, but actually it's far more, you know, a really good and successful and otherwise nice person may do things that cause racial harm or violence, you know. And sort of as a nation, we also have to kind of wrangle with what that means when actually some of the infrastructure and systems in our country that we think of as good, in kind of inverted marks, might also do harm in other ways. And so I think it's really interesting that it is so uncomfortable. This novel, I think I found, was often really under my skin, and the writing is very, very tense and very specific in parts as well. So I often found that I couldn't read more than about sort of 50-60 pages in a chunk. I mean, apart from when I got to the end and I sort of raced through the final 100 pages, as Shawn knows from me leaving voice notes of being like, just finish this part, blah, blah, blah. And then like about half an hour later, being like, just finish the book. But the book is so uncomfortable that I had to really take it in stages, because it's so meaty, and it's so difficult. It's so kind of squirmy as a book. And I think that's what's really clever about it.
Squirmy is a lovely word.
That's the official term.
It's fantastic. So what I would add, just to put another word in that is not quite nearly as lovely as yours, is that the narrative and the narrative strategy, I think, is to implicate the white reader, to just situate them right in the story, and the forgetting, like the family is forgetting about the promise and the reader is forgetting about the promise. The reader keeps forgetting. Maybe I can't extrapolate, and I'm not going to ask you how much of this happened for you, but I kept forgetting about the promise because I just got so wrapped up in all the other stuff going on in the story. And I think that was very intentional on Galgut's part. Two more things to say, and then maybe we'll put the spoiler curtain down or whatever. I don't want to give people an impression that this is an overtly political novel. I mean, because it's very much about characters. It's about the family members, and the story is very intense and well drawn. I think the characters, well, I wasn't sure about some of the characterization, but we'll maybe get to that in a minute. But it's really grounded in the gritty life of a really screwed up family at particularly important times over recent South African history.
Yeah.
It's not a political manifesto.
No, because it's interesting actually, because at one point there's a South African politician's name mentioned, and I actually found it quite startling, because I'm not sure if you found the same, but because for me, that suddenly not to say grounded in reality, it feels like a very real book, but that gave a really specific timestamp to it. And I think that's sort of, and although it speaks about very sort of specific political moments and sort of historical moments for South Africa, it was kind of quite interesting to me that the kind of mention of this politician's name just was like, oh, I was like, oh gosh, actually now we're leaving the farm, right? We're kind of, there's this other world, and now we've kind of situated this farm within wider South Africa. And it was quite startling, because I was sort of trying to think if a British novel, I mean, I think there would be some British novels where that's happened, where I think that someone suddenly mentioned Thatcher, and I've sort of like had a jolt of sort of remembering how real this book is. But yeah, it's really...
And I don't think Mandela's name is ever mentioned, is it?
I don't think so, actually. Gosh, I think you're right.
So. Yeah, Mbeki's name mentioned, and the guy, the architect, the prime minister that was the architect of apartheid. I never know how to pronounce his name. Verwoerd. That was the first political reference I remember. But
yeah,
it's very subtle.
It is, and I think in some ways that's quite clever, right? Because I think with it taking place on this farm, there is a sense that this farm feels remote from the rest of the world in some ways, but in its own way replicates some of the same parts of the national picture, right? It's kind of a microcosm of...
And we haven't talked yet about the writing. What I'd like to start talking about his writing, because I think he's a tremendous writer, and not only is the structure absolutely, it works so fantastically, but just the way he tells the story. So where I knew I was in, that I was holding a very special novel in my hand was the section very early where the mother's dead and the kids are all on their way home or are at home, and all the extended family, and there's all kinds of discord and muted grief and alcoholic behavior and so on. And then the narrative takes us into the bathroom in the basement and describes all the things that went into the toilet over the last hour. And the list of what went into that toilet just deepens the narrative and made me so curious about who put that in there and what was that about. And he doesn't explain everything, but he does explain some things. But I just thought, I don't think I remember ever reading something like that. Maybe I have, but I just thought, we're in the hands of a master craftsman here.
Yeah, this man can write. I don't think I've ever had a book where on pretty much, like, there was at one point, I feel like almost every other page I was like taking a picture on my phone of a paragraph or a sentence, or like on a sentence by sentence level, this book is remarkable. And like, I mean, I'm sometimes a bit of a sucker where like sometimes a book could have like zero plot or like not really be about anything, and sometimes I don't care if the writing style is really good. I mean, luckily this book has both, but this was a book where I think on the first page I was like, you know what, I'm sold. Like just the way, particularly kind of, you mentioned that sort of funeral, that toilet scene's really interesting. This isn't a spoiler because it happens literally on sort of page 1 or 2, but with the mother dead, there is a character who's basically just walking around being convinced that she's not dead, and almost every sentence is sort of something like, people are sort of saying, oh yeah, it happened, this evening or yesterday or whenever, and the character almost always interrupts it with his own thought of, oh no, when what didn't happen, when what didn't happen happened. Just as a kind of, you can sort of hear that sort of self-delusion in the narrative in such a striking way. And I was completely sold on it from that. And I think, interestingly, it sustained that kind of tightness of language. There are some really startling and disturbing images throughout the book. And it's so well handled. It doesn't feel like a weird cliche of like, oh, I'm just going to pick two random words and sort of solder them together and make a metaphor out of this, or, you know, like a simile or whatever. They're often really cleverly crafted of a sort of a violent or brutal image paired with something quite light, or compared with something kind of sort of combined with something quite subtle. And yeah, I love this book. I am like fully here. I mean, the only other book I've read of his is In a Strange Room, which the writing style in that is incredible, but very different from this book. Like that book is sort of full of silence and emptiness, and kind of it's sort of it's sort of so open, you know, kind of, especially because the character is often backpacking, and there's that kind of, it mirrors the silence of that kind of it's sort of internal thoughts while backpacking or whatever. And I think what's so brilliant about this book is it's kind of almost so noisy at times. It's so, there are so many sort of interrupting thoughts and so many sort of startling images sort of stacked on top of each other.
And apparently he has done some film writing recently, or
that does not surprise me, actually.
that he thinks that has kind of changed the way he writes fiction. I have a clip loaded up that I'd like to share, and then maybe it'll be time to go into spoilers. Yeah, we'll see. It's a couple minutes, and it's him. It's a Zoom chat he did with the gay American novelist, I think he's American, Peter Cameron, about this book, and he talks about where the germ of the idea came. So let me put that in here.
Your number of tabs is really upsetting me. It's really stressing me out.
It took a while to kind of dig into myself and find what it was I wanted to say next. Or just to say, I need to kind of figure out what my central preoccupation is. And I've reached the point in middle age, even later middle age, where my central preoccupation right now is time and the passage of time. So I guess I was looking, partly unconsciously, for a story that might work as a vehicle for that concern. And once you've got that sort of burning, you know, a lot of ideas might take root. And the one in this particular case that did strike came from an anecdote that a friend told me. It was just a casual conversation, but he's a friend who's a decade or so older than me, and he was telling me he happens to be the last surviving member of his family. He's lost both parents, his brother, his sister. He's the last person left. And he was telling me on a sort of semi-drunken afternoon a series of stories from the 4 family funerals he's attended. And a number of things struck me in that. Firstly, that funerals could be funny because they're not about the dead person, they're actually about the relations that attend. And secondly, that the same people tend to crop up. I mean, maybe a little bit older, maybe the situation is different, but that, you know, you're seeing the family funeral, the family essentially sort of moving along. And it sort of struck me that, you know, it would be an interesting way to tell the story of the family, just through a snapshot of 4 funerals. And you wouldn't get the sort of intervening time, you would just get that period of time. And you would have to kind of...
I think that's enough.
Yeah.
Isn't that fascinating?
It is. I kind of like that. I mean, because I guess that's a key structure of the book, right? And you alluded to it earlier, but this is without spoiling who dies. But each chapter heading or kind of section heading is named after the person who dies, and you basically only realize that by the second chapter, because the first part is called Ma dies. Then you see the title of the second part, and you know, you don't necessarily think about it, you know, and then that character dies, and then as soon as the third section starts, you begin it with this sort of sense of foreboding of well, are they going to die now as well? Is this, you know, am I being hoodwinked by this book into now thinking that this person's going to die? And then by the time you get to the fourth one, you're like, well, I'm fairly sure they're going to die now.
And I mentioned to you the American TV show 6 Feet Under, which you haven't seen, but yeah, it's a very much character. One of the characters dies at the beginning. Well, it's not a character, but it's that TV show is set in a funeral home, so that we show the death of the person that they're working on for that episode. And so you get kind of on pins and needles at the beginning of each episode.
Cool. So those are that's kind of discussing the book with pre or sort of light spoiler kind of section. We're about to go into a few more spoilers, so by all means, if you have not yet read the book and feel like you would sort of not want to hear anything more from sort of any spoilery bits, feel free to stop now. Please do come back after you've read. I kind of would love to hear some of the sort of discussions on this, because I think this book is so rich for those kinds of discussions, but we're about to go into some spoilery territory. So with that warning there,
now we can say everybody dies.
Everybody. I think there is something so special about the way that the deaths are handled in this book, because I think that really creeping sense of everyone dying it's sort of somewhat emblematic of the whole kind of discussion of the book, right? Of the idea that tides are changing in South Africa and that opinions are shifting, and that seems to start shifting with certain characters, with the more quote unquote outdated views dying off. And I know that you mentioned something in the notes when we were sort of chatting about this in one of your voice notes about the death of the second character and how it happened, because I almost missed it. I almost assumed it was a metaphor. Right? Sorry, say that again.
We can name him now. We're in spoiler territory. That's Paul, right?
That's Paul, yeah.
And I didn't remember, what did I say?
Well, because I'm glad you said it, because I almost missed it, which is how he dies via snake.
Yeah, so he's a kooky guy. He's a reptile zoo, or it's more than a zoo. What is it, like an amusement park? I don't know. It's just this weird thing where he's got a bunch of crocodiles or whatever he's got, and he dies from a snake bite. But there's a dastardly preacher in this novel and he convinces him to go into the, I don't want to say it, I'm probably not adding enough nuance, but basically the preacher convinces Pa to go into the cage with this poisonous snake as some kind of a religious test, and the snake bites him and he dies. It's wacky.
It is.
It's kind of perfect.
Yeah, I think because I almost missed it, because in my mind I thought we were kind of just going down a bit of a metaphor, because there's this whole sort of religious thing bound up with it that makes it sort of sound like, the snake from the Garden of Eden, and sort of the kind of the evil serpent kind of thing.
Some of that going on there, but it was kind of that cap over the top way that I thought it was perfect.
Yeah, same, because that's why I almost missed it, because I genuinely thought this was just sort of, he'd been like stabbed or shot, and then that was being referred to as sort of like a bite from a serpent, and then you realize it genuinely was a bite from a serpent, which and it was almost such a weirdly melodramatic death compared to some of the other almost underdramatic death compared to some of the others, because there's all this kind of fanfare around some of the other people's deaths or whatever, and particularly when we get to the third and fourth parts of the book, so many sort of people with vested interests and sort of bits of betrayal, that it's really interesting to sort of see a death that literally just sort of comes from a snake bite, and it almost feels so random. And even though there's sort of the kind of the circumstances around it are a little bit sort of suspicious or whatever, there's something so almost sort of random and it's just like a random happenstance that causes his death, in that sense, almost, if you see what I mean. It's kind of, it wasn't caused by another human, it was a snake. And for me, that I thought that was really effective.
Kind of like getting hit by lightning.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll leave that one there. I didn't think all of the characterization in this novel worked. It didn't bother me enough to knock it off 5 stars.
Yeah.
I just love this book so much. But usually characterization is one of the most important things. And I thought some of the characterization, particularly in the last couple chapters, moved into caricature, territory. And the one character that, even though I loved some of the scenes with him, was that preacher who was going blind, Elwyn Simmers. What did you make of him?
Yeah, I think if I'm right as well, didn't he always appear with his surname? Like I don't think he was ever Elwyn, really. He was almost always Elwyn Simmers, I think. I mean, it did get a little bit bombastic and a bit silly towards the end, like especially with Desiree, who I loved. Like Desiree was possibly my favorite because I mean I favorite character in the sense of just how she was painted, because it was so absurd. She sort of created as a sort of white woman with too much time and money on her hands, who's sort of convinced that that she's been the first person to ever discover spirituality, and that sort of, you know, any stressful situation can be alleviated by paying a lot of money to a kind of guru. And so a little bit of that towards the end, I was like, especially because the rest of the book is so like tight and serious and whatever, I was like, is this just the comic relief? Or like at times I was like, oh, are we, like with Elwyn Simmers, are we kind of, is it going a bit caricature here? But I actually I
thought Desiree, I couldn't, there was no continuity between her as the younger girlfriend and who she became. But I also asked myself, aren't there people like that in the world who change so much when they grow up that they're unrecognizable? So I gave him the benefit of the doubt, just like I did about the fact that Pa in the first chapter, I didn't think his character really came together. It didn't cohere, but he was also immersed in such complex grief that why would he have to make sense when he's dealing with all stuff? I could explain away quite a bit of it, but Elwyn, he seemed like such a wuss and such a timid kind of mockable. Anton, the son, he has a great time mocking and insulting Elwyn. But in the, which chapter was it where he had kind of moved away from his congregation and into kind of a more evangelical thing where he had a whole bunch of followers? Now that doesn't compute. He has no charisma. So that bugged me. But anyway, don't have to go down a rabbit hole about it. But there was one detail revealed about, and even though we're in spoiler territory, I don't think it's necessary to mention it, but there was one detail about him and his sister that I thought was completely unnecessary and distracting, and I think that was a misstep. But it was like one sentence on one page. But
I don't know, part of me kind of liked having those characters because I think they were meant to sort of in some ways flesh out the kind of wider world outside of this family. Particularly so Desiree, I realize I can keep talking about Desiree, but she really stuck in my mind. But I think partly I found her really interesting because, I mean, although it's an easy sort of stereotype to mock, like it's low-hanging fruit in some ways, I think bringing her in was quite clever, not only as a bit of comic relief, but she is a character who you can totally see basically saying that she doesn't see race, that she's sort of very much painted as like a white middle class liberal who actually hasn't done any work or like doesn't really care about the issues but cares about being seen to be right. So, you know, she is sort of constantly talking about kind of the sort of exotic mysticism and how she's going to sort of apply that to her own life, but doesn't notice that she's being incredibly harmful to everyone around her. So I thought she was really interesting in that sense of sort of a character who, I mean, again, very low-hanging fruit. Like, this is not, he didn't create this character out of nowhere. She's not, you know, it's not particularly nuanced at times, but I thought it was quite interesting to have her as a kind of foil to some of the other characters, because characters like Amor really grows in many ways, and there especially bits towards the end that I really want to talk about with Amor.
I want to talk about
because I thought that was really that some of those final scenes were so interesting. But I think as a sort of foil, because Desiree has kind of learned nothing, and all of sort of, but at the same time, Desiree is the person walking around claiming to have the most knowledge. You know, she's almost seeing herself as being quite enlightened and sort of being so sort of spiritual and awakened. And what we actually really learn about her is that is incredibly shallow. It's all kind of an appropriated belief system from somebody else. And she operates as if she's sort of she single-handedly is cleansing the toxins from South Africa, without realizing that she's perpetuating racial harm, and that she is sorry, I realize I'm banging on a lot about Desiree, but that really stuck in my mind.
Yeah. Oh, that's fabulous, because I didn't pay as much attention to her, other than I thought she was a little bit over the top.
Yeah.
But what you're saying dovetails with a couple other things in the novel that he does that's really shows, what would you say, his satirization, his pessimism about racial harmony, the Rainbow Nation, like what is it? So there, Pa dies in a hospital room next to a black man, and the narrator, I think it's, or maybe it's Anton, that actually thinks, yes, we have progressed to the point where we can die next to each other, but we still haven't figured out how to live next to each other. I thought that was a really good line. And the other thing is, and I think this one I'm going to keep as not talk about it in a spoilery way, even though we're in spoilery territory here. There is another character who was really racist in the first chapter, and I can't remember if it's the second or the third. I think it's the third chapter. She has progressed to the point where she is so post-apartheid enlightened that she is, and she's a white woman, she is sleeping, she's having a extramarital affair with her husband's black business partner. Ooh, racial progress.
Yeah, it's he does sort of, he really poke, it's almost merciless how he pokes fun at certain bits of that, right, of kind of really poking holes at sort of in sort of some of the established sort of truths of sort of South Africa, is kind of, you know, the stories that nations tell themselves, right, the kind of, so it was interesting, sort of the same month I read The Promise, I also read Michael Taylor's The Interest, which is all about the abolition of the slave trade in the UK. And it's interesting sort of having those sort of two side by side to some degree, because the sort of the tales that were being sort of, the narratives that are being sort of told nationally and still are being told in the UK really are often, you know, good white guys came in and stopped that naughty bad racism and that naughty slavery, without kind of acknowledging that it's a much bigger issue. It was being perpetuated by white people in the first place, should never have happened, and also that there are massive repercussions of people having been enslaved for so long. And it's interesting because I think you can almost feel that Damon Galgut is so like sick of the conversations that South Africa is having about itself, of kind of, I also say this not, you know, not knowing necessarily what some of those are, but I feel like Galgut gives us that sense that the country is saying, oh, we're this, you know, we're kind of, look, we're sort of post-apartheid, we're kind of, we've come out of a really difficult time, we're good now. And Galgut doesn't really seem to want to let South Africa off the hook on that.
And just as you were relating it to your experience as a Brit, can we say Brit? Is that a politically correct term these days?
Yeah.
As a white settler Canadian who is coming to terms with how my whiteness and the whiteness of Canada has been a malevolent force in Canada, but Canadians love to prattle along and do their little superior dance about how much better they are than South Africa or America, and it's bullshit, or just bad. I really read this from that place, that this is broadly applicable. And that literary mechanism which he keeps encouraging you to forget and stuff, that's totally Canada. We realize we've got a problem with Indigenous peoples, that we have mistreated them, and we have caused genocide, and then the Olympics is on, let's forget about it, or whatever to distract us. And that's how I was reading it, and it was powerful for where I am from.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing it. I think that's the really kind of important thing about this. And I think actually it's kind of one of those things that fiction, I think, often does better than nonfiction, in that sense of it kind of allows you to sort of seep into the story and then flip it on you. Whereas, you know, you can obviously do that with nonfiction, but I think with something like this, just kind of getting inside the mind of this white South African family, only to sort of have it all inverted. And maybe this is a good time to talk about kind of parts towards the end with Amor, but there's a conversation that I loved. I just thought this was so well done. Oh, actually, firstly, there's a moment with Amor at the beginning of the book where she suddenly, quote unquote, discovers racism, in the sense that I've got it here somewhere. It's sort of, hang on, because I remember taking a picture of this because this is incredible. Here we go. You are not serious, but then he looks at her and sees how serious she is. Oh dear me, he says, do you have no idea what country you're living in? No, she doesn't. Amor is 13 years old. History has not yet trod on her. She has no idea what country she's living in. She has seen black people running away from the police because they're not carrying their passbooks, and heard adults talking in urgent, low voices about riots in the townships. And only last week at school, they had to learn a drill about hiding under tables in case of attack. And she still doesn't know what country she's living in. And there's this whole section really early on about how Amor is just sort of, basically, you know, she's grown up white in a little sort of farm, is sort of somewhat removed, and sort of has only really had interactions with the kind of really difficult, grisly parts of South Africa at a distance. And there's a passage right towards the end of the book, which in some ways is her growth, but is also really telling, where the promise is sort of being carried out. There's you know, enough people have sort of died in the family for Amor to be able to consider handing over this farm, and in doing so to go to Salome. Salome's son, I want to say, Salome's son is there and says, basically, do you expect us to be grateful? This is 30 or 40 years too late. Like, my mother has been living in horrible, Salome has been living in horrible conditions for years. And now only when, you know, only sort of when
really
when you
that much anymore,
when it's not worth much, when you don't need it.
Tested land and
yeah. And, you know, and it's got holes in the roof and rain comes through. Only now are you considering giving us this to us? Do you expect us to be grateful? And you know, Amor, to her credit, does sort of say, actually, no, like, I get it. Like, I get that this is me doing the right thing too late, but it is me doing the right thing, the thing that was promised to you all along. And I don't expect a medal for this. Like, in fact, but at the same time, there is that really uncomfortable conversation, you know, in the same way that when nations talk about reparations, for example, a lot of the time, people are kind of quite rightly say, well, this is too late. Actually, giving us some money now does nothing to make up for the fact that for 30, 40, 50 more years, we've been living a terrible existence. This is not justice. This is kind of a really poor attempt at it, because actually, and now we also don't have the, you know, we've had a poorer quality of life. We don't have the generational wealth to pass on to our children because of this. Like, this doesn't stop at you giving us a check for 30,000. Like, this doesn't stop. The system is, the game is still rigged. The system is still unfair. And so I think this conversation towards the end of the book, I just thought was so powerful. I know in some ways it's a bit of a neat wrap up of the book. But I know we sort of spoke about this a bit in voice notes. I think the book had to end with a sense of hope. Otherwise, in some ways, what's the point, right? Like, you know, what would be the point otherwise in fighting for anything, I think is sort of what Galgut's sort of getting at. So although it does sort of tie up a little bit at the end, it's an uncomfortable tie up, because it's kind of, well, the promise has been met, but it's an imperfect promise.
It's an incredibly problematic hope, but the hope is there. And I think that many readers struggle with Amor's character. Is she enlightened? Is she naive? What is she? And I think you can interpret her character many ways, but she is kind of the moral heart of the story.
Yes.
And the fact that she is confronted by Salome's son, whose name I have forgotten, which is really bad considering the context of everything raised in this story. The way that he confronts her, I think it's perfect. If that hadn't been there and it was all la la la, that would have been a really ineffective, but it was very complex and very problematic ending, I thought. One of the first quotes in the book that got me intrigued by Amor is, and this is the first person, so this is maybe when she's coming back for her father's funeral. I ran from all of you as hard and as far as I could, but the past has its little claws. Oh, I've mistyped it. I gotta look it up here. I've typed it and it's not right. So let's do that again. I did using dictation software. I ran from all of you as hard and as far as I could, but the past has its little claws. It has dragged me back. And so she's the one that kind of leaves and goes far, far away from the family. She's not the only one. Anton does for quite a while too, but and she has to keep going back for these funerals, and we see her at various stages of her life, but she is the one that never lets go of that promise.
Yeah.
And she's the one that does her damnedest to effectuate it at the end. I thought she was one of the more fascinating characters I've encountered in anything I've read in years.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's weird, because I think I almost, not so overlooked her early on in the book, but I think I was much more focused on Anton for a while. And it was only sort of towards the end of the book again, I was like, oh, like Amor's quite interesting here, actually. And especially she's sort of been the glue in that family, right? Whereas everyone else has sort of died, and although she disappears, and there's a whole sort of drama about the fact that she couldn't be invited to this funeral and yada, yada, yada. She's the one who does things like really understanding Anton enough so that when she discovers, you know, the unfinished novel of his, she has a much better insight into it than is it Desiree? The person, yeah, I think it is. Then who's sort of annoyed that it's an unfinished novel that she then can't sell and make money from. Like she's almost so frustrated, like, oh, of course he'd have an unfinished novel that I can't do anything with, you know, typical Anton. And I love that, you know, and she quickly, Desiree also quickly moves on to kind of sleeping with her guru, kind of yogi sort of character. But I love that Amor kind of comes in and has that really, and obviously, you know, brother sister kind of thing as well, but has a really detailed understanding of what it must have been like for him to not complete it. And I found something so heartbreaking about the way that she sort of leafs through these pages, and we know that Anton's put so much thought into it, and it's sort of been such a big preoccupation of his, but it's also been a lie. It's, you know, he's sort of been saying to everyone he's been writing this book for years, and he's written sort of a few pages, and it's really incomplete and whatever. And I love that she really has this such a deep, empathetic response to this book of, I can imagine how frustrating that must have been for him, but actually this sort of makes me love him more, almost.
Yes, and it's to Damon Galgut's credit that he kept me emotionally invested, that I could actually feel that.
Yeah.
Could I feel that and be invested in those characters and still hang on to, but what about the promise to Salome? And for me, I kept forgetting for pages of it. And one of the first things I said in this chat was that I was pissed off that there weren't Black South African writers nominated for the Booker. And how many times have I remembered that as we've been talking about all these fascinating Afrikaner characters in this incredible novel by Damon Galgut. And it's all just kind of layers of that analogy of how easy it is to go about our white lives, reading our white novels, and forget about all the people we're treading upon. So I just think it's really fascinating in a really troubling way. Yeah,
that's a really good point. Although I thought, whether intentionally or not, I thought in the novel itself, the fact that we kept on like forgetting the promise was quite relevant, right? It was the fact that when the promise comes back up, everyone's like, oh yeah, that old thing. Yeah. It doesn't really mean anything. And I think that's it,
you're bringing that up again. You brought that up at the last two funerals. What the hell?
Yeah, because I think that's what's so interesting, because there's that moment early on where we learn that, you know, a few characters sort of talk about it and say, well, but it's impossible. Even if you wanted to give that to Salome, legally you cannot do that. Because she's Black, she cannot own or inherit property in this way. And so, you know, that it's interesting that when that legally changes, actually the characters don't automatically flip into, oh, we can do this now, let's do it. It's actually the promise gets forgotten. And I think that's a really intelligent, I mean, I'm guessing it's intentional, but it felt like quite an intelligent point throughout the book of actually, you know, legal changes are good and should be done to kind of, you know, protect people, but actually ultimately it doesn't mean that it changes overnight, in the same way that, you know, anti-hate crime legislation doesn't you know, make hate crime disappear. It's an important thing to have that legislation, but that hate crime still exists, and it's just now punishable. And I think that's sort of something that was quite interesting for me with the family, that they're kind of like, oh, that promise thing again, yeah, whatever. But it's actually legally possible now. All the characters needed to do was have that kind of agency, but it's really clear, and kind of like Salome's son says, they didn't do it when it would have actually hurt them. They're kind of doing it at the end where it's easy. And that is a really interesting thing that kind of comes up a lot in sort of discussions around race and racism, of, you know, actually giving up your power, your resources, your privilege. That's a difficult but important thing to do. But it's interesting that that almost only ever seems to sort of happen at the later stages, when it's as soon as it becomes easy, right? Of kind of like, oh, now we're going to do it, because it would almost hurt us more to not do it. Whereas I think that's part of the danger of that promise, isn't it? That characters only really do it when it's sort of expedient in some form to do it.
We don't know, as we heard Damon Galgut talk about the fact that, you know, the way that it's structured, you don't really know what's going on with the characters in between these funerals. We get a little bit of a flashback occasionally, but for the most part we don't. So we don't really know. It seems like Amor has been preoccupied by fairly socially conscious, selfless jobs and so on. She was working as a nurse and volunteering in HIV and this and that.
Yeah.
But of any of the other white characters, she's the one that's never let it go. That she heard the promise, she has not forgotten the promise, and she's the only one that did anything about it. Is it enough? No, it's not.
Yeah.
The one quote that I would really like to get in here, now that we're in spoiler territory, is one of the most powerful sections of one of the most powerful sentences in the book. I think Eric talked about it or gestured toward it, and it's at page 284. And this is the narration is third person and focused on Salome. And this is there's only about 15 pages or less left in the novel. So the she here is Salome, and she's now an old woman. And I think this is even written after, this is just after Amor has passed over the papers and gets their bank account number to put in quite a sizable chunk of change into their bank account. She's been thinking, so she is Salome. She's been thinking lately that it might not be so very bad to go back to where she came from and live out her last years in her tiny village. I got the pronunciation here. Just outside Mahikeng, only 320 kilometers away. And if Salome's house hasn't been mentioned before, it's because you have not asked. You didn't care to know. And to me, that is where some of the stuff that I was talking about in the non-spoilery section, that's where I was just chilled to the bone. Oh my God, that's just incredible. So I did a little bit, not a deep dive, but a shallow dive into Mahikeng, and that is the capital city of what's now known as the Northwest Province of South Africa. And the history of it is fascinating, and it was a colonial, during the Boer War, it was one of the, and then it became a kind of semi-autonomous territory. It didn't actually join up with the country of South Africa until, I forget, maybe the mid-20th century, but it was always a place where the blacks were completely oppressed and had maybe the Bantustan. I better not say anymore because I'm going to make a mistake, but it's a fraught territory, and that is where Salome comes. And it made me want to read a whole bunch of books about the new name of it. It used to be called Mafeking, and now it's been renamed Mahikeng, and that's where Salome's from. So that was fascinating to me. But really, the main point I want to make is that narrative address to the reader just got all the way inside me.
Yeah, and it's really quite startling, right? Because the book really shifts quite a lot from first to third person. I mean, it's sometimes quite unsettling how quickly it will swing from a first person to a third person and back again. And so that sudden address in the second person of you is actually is so startling in this book, particularly sort of so near the end. And it does, you are kind of like, oh gosh, yeah, you're right. And I love that. And I think particularly because this is such an uncomfortable topic for so many people to talk about, the fact that it's in the second person is so vital, because there needs to be that kind of thing breaking through to kind of remind the reader that they are complicit in some form, or can be. It could be complicit.
This novel has a really high rating on Goodreads. I've heard little criticism. I have heard some, and it's not a novel that's going to work for every reader.
Sure.
But yeah, I think that it really nails it for many a reader. And
Yeah.
I think it's a story that made me understand my whiteness in a new way.
I think so. Yeah, I think same for me. I think it's so sort of. I like that Galgut could have played it easy, and he didn't. I think it would have been quite a boring book actually if he had played it easy, but because it would have been white person standing watching being like, isn't this sad? And I think actually what's so powerful about it is he really, as I was saying earlier, kind of goes into the belly of the beast and is just like, this is grim and we're going to have to sit in this and feel a bit uncomfortable for a while, because actually that's kind of what we need to do. And I like it when authors sort of do that, because it's not a comfortable read. You're not going to sort of casually take this on holiday and have a great time. Like,
I don't think I have read a novel written by a white writer that goes where this novel goes in a way that is problematizes, interrogates, those are horrible words, but situates the reader deep in the problematic heart of whiteness in a way that this does. It's really a stunning literary achievement.
Yes, it really is. And like the only comparison point I could find book-wise of things I've read before with like Coetzee's Disgrace, which is really uncomfortable, but not this kind of uncomfortable. That deals with it in a very different manner. But this was so, yeah. I'm interested as well. How did it compare to you compare for you with The Good Doctor by Galgut? Because for me, like, this is such a different novel from In a Strange Room, but I see how it's from the same author.
Right. And I can't answer the question because I read it so long ago that I remember nothing about it.
Right.
I just remember that I really liked it and that it was about a doctor.
Was the doctor good?
But I want to read everything he's written now.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think Eric also recommended, was it Arctic Summer? Arctic something?
Yes, I think Arctic Summer, but we can let's double check that, but I think that was it.
Yeah. By Galgut. But yeah, I mean, I love this, and I think it kind of, I found myself really being quite spellbound by it, because I think I mean, in fairness, I went into it knowing that I'd probably end up liking it a bit anyway, because I loved In a Strange, I mean, I will keep on talking about this book till I die, but In a Strange Room by Damon Galgut is just like, for me, mind-blowing. And but it's such a different novel. Like, that novel is a lot more about kind of queerness and kind of the unspokenness of desire and kind of isolation and loneliness. And I mean, for me, is pretty much as close to a perfect novel as you can get. But The Promise, I'm just like, this is mind-blowing, and I'm really glad that I read this. Really glad that the long list also sort of sped up me getting around to it.
Yes, it belongs on the long list, and I have said a couple times on my channel that I don't think the Booker Prize should go to 2 white writers in a row, but I also haven't read anything else on the Booker long list. I'm a ways into a few others at the moment, but this is a Booker Prize-worthy novel.
Yeah, if this doesn't make the shortlist, I'll be really surprised.
I'm not as Bookerish as you are. It's just a stunning novel.
That's a good thing. Stay away, like, don't get sucked into doing all the long lists. But no, it's this is the thing. I mean, I've read about 4 of the long list so far. This is hands down my favorite. Obviously I've not read the rest of them. They may be great. I've got a couple of the others around me in this room, but I would be very surprised if this book doesn't make the shortlist, just because for me it's so strong and it's so relevant and current, and sort of it deals with such important issues that it would be quite weird to see it edged out. I mean, that said, I want to check out the rest of the long list anyway, but you know, I kind of feel like Galgut would deserve his 3rd shortlist for this book. Yeah,
maybe he'll take it. So, well, what do you think? We've been talking for about an hour. Should we wrap it up?
Let's do that. So people can get back to their lives. But yeah, thank you so much, Shawn.
Why don't I do the very quick wrap up?
Yes, yes, please.
So that brings our discussion of The Promise by Damon Galgut to a close, but please continue this discussion in the comments below on whose ever channel you're watching this on, because there's that much more to say. There's much more to say than that about this incredible work of literary fiction. Bob, this was a great buddy read, thank you, and a great chat.
Yes, thank you.
Eric, I'm expecting an essay-length comment.
I love that we're kind of pitching this as sort of Eric fodder of like, are you listening, Eric?
Eric's the one that got us kind of into the book,
Yes.
hooked up, interested in reading the book and thinking of it as a Booker Prize-worthy book. And yeah, so I'm really curious to hear what Eric has to say about what we had to say.
Yes, and do check out Eric's video on it. It's brilliant.
Yes, we're going to link
so
that.
insightful.
Yes. Thanks for watching.
Thank you. Take care.